From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Tonight we're going to talk about violas, Antonio Stradivari, and the sound of violas. And we're really lucky tonight to be joined by John Montgomery from Raleigh, North Carolina. He's a violin maker and restorer, and John and I have been working together for the last 10 years here at the Library of Congress. We have a dual role together, making sure that the instruments are in museum exhibition condition and also in playing condition because of the wonderful concerts that we give here. We're also joined by two members of this evening's concert program, Jessica Bodner, the violist with the Parker String Quartet, and Kikuei Ikeda from the Tokyo String Quartet. And welcome to both of you, and welcome to all of you. As you all pretty much know by now, about 1935 to 1937, the library received an amazing gift of 5 Stradivari instruments. And in 1977, the library received another gift of a loan of a Stradivari viola. And tonight we have the gift of the sound of those violas, the really rare opportunity to hear them tonight and to hear us talk about them. So with that, I think I'd like to start with John and ask you, John, I know that there are hundreds of violins by Stradivari that are extant, but I really only know of about 10 violas. There are 2 in this room. So he lived a really long time. Can you explain that one to me?
So yeah, it's a very special moment that we get to hear, and there would be people who would travel the world to have a chance to hear 2 Stradivari violas in one concert, so this is very special for everyone. And I also will talk a little bit about Stradivari as the inventor, the genius, the creator. I mean, in a way, he's the Leonardo da Vinci of the string instrument world. And he was always developing and thinking and creating and designing, and that's what's interesting about these 2 instruments and his work. So, but along with that, it's an interesting question to bring up because there are so few of them. So we know of about 600 or 700 Stradivari instruments today, meaning violins, violas, cellos. He made a couple of guitars and a mandolin or 2. Out of that, there's 10. We know of 10 violas today that are fully made by Stradivari. Now, I've found some commissions that we don't know ever got built, or if they got built, they're gone, which might bring that number up to maybe 20. But still, out of 600, this is a very small number. So we're going to look a little bit at, I'm going to call it the juvenile era of the viola. Not the birth, because we had violas especially made in a nearby town. So Stradivari worked in Cremona in Italy, and there was a nearby town at Lake Garda called Brescia. And in Brescia, there were 2 famous makers, Gaspar da Salo and Giovanni Maggini. They were making violas. But then there was a gap where we weren't really seeing much being done with the viola until Stradivari comes along. What's interesting is how people were listening to music back then, and I asked both Kikuei and Jessica what early viola repertoire they knew, and they both basically said, not really a lot. When you get to being a viola player, you're focusing on great things from the 19th and 20th century. So it was a time when it was being formed. The viola sound was being formed. Now it's coming into its own. It's got its great presence. That's been true for a couple hundred years now. But still, sometimes we feel like the viola is the forgotten child. Jessica informed me that next year in Berlin is the year of the viola. So we're going to see that change. It's like almost like a Chinese zodiac year. It'll be the year of the viola. All viola players will rise to the top. But of Stradivari's violas, it's really exciting that we actually have today the molds that Stradivari built his violas on in the Stradivari Museum in Cremona, and it's just by luck that that ended up happening. So Stradivari made his first viola that we know of in 1672, and he built that on a mold, and that mold is in the museum in Cremona. He never built another one on that mold, so obviously he was a little bit frustrated with that one. And then a very, very exciting thing happened in the life of Stradivari. Now I'm going to say, so Stradivari was born in 1644. We don't have a lot of records about Stradivari's life. We do know that he got married when he was about 23 years old. We know that he moved into one of his first, bought his first house in 1680. And then he builds this viola before that. But probably the most, I'm going to say, from my observation, one of the most important moments in Stradivari's life was when the Grand Duke of Tuscany's son, Prince Ferdinand, decides to commission it was really 6 instruments from Stradivari for the Medicis. And many of us know how important the Medicis were in the arts and what big patrons they were. So he orders these instruments, and those 6 instruments were a cello, 2 very big violas we call tenors. These are like, when we measure violas, we measure the backs, and we talk about the back length. So those instruments might have been 18 inches long, whereas the violas that are being performed tonight are going to be a little over 16 inches long. 2 inches is a big deal, you guys can agree. So 2 tenors, so I'm going to call them little cellos. And then what they called a contralto, which is actually this very instrument, which we call the Tuscan. So sometimes we call it the Tuscan-Medici, and you can see the reasoning, the Medici family and the Duke of Tuscany. And then 2 violins. So that was the commission. And Stradivari was totally taken by this commission. This was a very, very important thing. So for this, he's going to redesign the instruments. So he creates the new mold for this very instrument. He also creates the mold for the tenor, which we call the de Medici, which is still today in Italy. That very mold is still in Cremona today. So that's very exciting. And for the rest of his life, all his violas were made, the 8 more. So we have the first one that never got made again. We have the tenor, which is the great big one. And then we know of 8 more that are made on the same mold as this one. So it's a very exciting moment historically. There's so much we don't know about instruments, but when you finally have the actual thing with his signature and it's here today and we can compare it with this very instrument, which we've tracked all those years, we're pretty sure of what we're talking about.
So John, our 2 violas here range from 1690 to 1727. So on the same mold, but what are the similarities or differences in the types and the forms of the 2 of these?
So 1690, because of this commission, became one of the most important times for Stradivari, and that time lasted for 10 years. It's a time when Stradivari built instruments on what we call a long pattern, meaning the instruments were a little bit narrower than he would build later, and then that we today think of as the normal violin. So these would have been a little narrower and just a little bit longer. So you can imagine if I take a violin and I stretch it out like that, it's going to make it, the arches are going to be more barrel-shaped, if that makes sense. So an interesting thing was that the arches of those instruments made in Brescia that were made, let's say, almost 100 years earlier, were very barrel-shaped. And so people were interested in that shape, and Stradivari was too. The gap partially happens, I like to insert this here, because of the plague in 1628-29, and Maggini, the second of those 2 makers in Brescia, dies in the plague, so as does one of the Amatis. So the plague kind of wipes out a lot of information and knowledge, and maybe a certain continuum that might have caused a sooner development of the viola sound. But I'll stop and talk a second about this more elongated, rounder, arched sound. Because of the architecture, it comes deeper and more blending and more warmy kind of sound. Now later in Strad's life, he starts to broaden them a little bit and flatten the arches, and now you get more of a solo kind of a sound. And maybe I'll just take this moment, because I know everybody always is excited at these concerts, at these talks, to hear the instruments. But a couple things I wanted to emphasize, and Kikuei might mention. So one of the things that's exciting today about Stradivari violas, and actually has been true for a couple hundred years, is the opportunity to put a quartet of Stradivari instruments together. And you can see that the bottleneck is going to be the viola. We've got hundreds and hundreds of violins, over 100 cellos, but all of a sudden now we only have 10 chances on the viola. And of those 10, one of them is a tenor, which is a great big thing that few people really want to play. It doesn't work the same way in the quartet sound. The reason why I'm digressing is because we have a player who played with one of those violas, and Kikuei, maybe you could talk about it.
Yes. Is this live? Could you hear me? Yeah. Yes, we have used this set of Stradivarius called Paganini. And Paganini, Niccolo Paganini is the Italian violinist, and he collected all these instruments by himself and made a quartet. And the viola particularly is quite famous, became quite famous because it's called the Paganini viola. And we always kid with a violist that this instrument is really made as a solo viola, which is rather rare, you know. And this I could play really like a soloist. Mm-hmm. And once we were reading chamber music together, maybe I had a little few wine too much. I was really playing loud, I guess. So my cousin, he's a violist by nature, but we always call him, he's a frustrated violinist. Once he has some few drinks, he wouldn't stop playing violin. And I wouldn't stop playing viola. and I was playing really into it because sometimes the instrument asks you could do more, you could play more. So I play more and more, and he finally stopped playing. Because I was really playing over the board, you know, really. And this is the kind of instrument that he commissioned the Italian, how old in Italy, the Berlioz?
Hector Berlioz.
Right. Mm-hmm. And he was supposed to play this, and this instrument would have been really ideal to play with the orchestra. Right. Except he didn't like the piece so much, so he didn't.
But if you're Paganini, you can do that.
Right.
Back then. Well, you know, it's interesting to hear that soloistic kind of description of the instrument. And that one was 1731?
Yes.
Yeah. So 1731, and just to kind of switch things around, tonight you're going to get a chance to hear these two. Kikuei's going to be actually playing the 1690 Tuscan that we started talking about. Jessica's going to be playing the Cassavetti, which is from 1727, so a few years earlier than the Paganini. And the reason why I'm pointing out the chronology is to help you to start to hear and see differences as Stradivari might have, and this soloistic sound. And when Jessica and I were talking earlier, we were talking about the sound of the Cassavetti. Maybe you could talk for a second about that, and also the challenge of being a viola player in a quartet and your solution.
Oh, sure. Well, I guess I have to first start by saying I wish I could have a chance to try that viola out. I would love to see what that feels like. No, but the Cassavetti that I'm playing is definitely it has a brighter sound than what I think most violists look for today when they're looking for a sound, but it's something that's really, it's a challenge because it's not what I'm personally used to, but it's also a real pleasure to be able to experience this very, very different sound. I guess that it's something that is kind of in between the vibrations of a violin sound and the sort of lower vibrations that I'm used to with the viola. Yeah. And then in terms of the viola's place in the quartet, we were talking a little bit about how maybe for most of you, you've seen violists sitting on the outside of the quartet where, first violin, second violin, cello, viola, and that's how we sat for a really long time, and then about 4 or 5 years.
Let me just insert here. When the viola is sitting like that, the sound holes of the viola are actually pointing to the back of the stage, meaning the sound is pretty much going towards the quartet as opposed to you, the audience.
Right, and we had also talked about how when violists sit on the outside, they have to learn to turn out. And in a way, that's a great tool because when you turn out, you're automatically redirecting, first of all, everybody's focus in the audience, and then you're also redirecting the sound of the viola. So that's something that I really experimented with a lot, and I became comfortable with it. However, we had a few interactions with different people, and we were playing some pieces, particularly Beethoven's Opus 131. And our cellist actually had wanted to try sitting on the outside. And when we tried sitting on the inside, I was actually very, very reluctant because I had worked so hard to figure out how to turn out and how to find my sound in that kind of figuration. But then when we were playing, especially this Beethoven quartet, it really just made so much sense with the way the voices pass. And as we played more pieces, we really, really liked it. I love being able to sit next to the second violin and to just feel that presence so directly. And then it also has its challenges because the cello not being in the middle, it's harder, it's more difficult to center your sound from the cello actually being in the center. So it has those challenges as well, but it's something, and I was saying also before that I always felt like I had to play maybe 10 or 20% more than I really wanted to when I sat on the outside, and now sitting on the inside, I maybe only play 5% more than I want to.
So it really goes along with having the year of the viola next year. She'll be right in the center tonight.
With Kikuei.
But it works wonderfully with this viola and you sitting in the center and the passages that you have.
Yeah,
I
well,
think the audience will really love hearing that tonight with both of you there. I think.
Great.
Yeah, you might say a word about the Dvorak and the viola.
Yeah,
The Dvorak.
especially the Dvorak.
Oh, well, Dvorak in general is really great for viola. And this piece is wonderful for viola. Actually, the second viola gets to start the first and second movements, which is pretty amazing. And then there are some huge solos for the first viola and for also second viola, some solos. So it's a wonderful piece. I know Dvorak was also a violist, and just in many of the quartets that we've played, there are always really, really special viola parts, and just the flavor of the viola he gets in such an amazing and special way.
So I thought maybe this would be a good time, Kikuei, maybe just to play a little bit on the Tuscan, just so we can hear it. I mean, this is where if we were doing a cooking show, you'd all get a taste. But you might think of what I talked about how Strad was hearing these and how his earlier sounds were his ears were being influenced by those violas from Brescia, which today they're being played, but a lot of them have been cut down because they were way too big to be played. So by cutting them down, you even have more of a barrel-shaped instrument. And later, afterwards, I could talk to people if they're interested to know how that's done. So this is the Tuscan.
I will start with the low string. This morning, John and I worked a little bit on the C string.
Some adjustments.
And I felt the C string was not quite ringing, but now he has a magic hand. So it's ringing now, and I'm very happy.
Very good. Okay, that's good. Yeah, this is
This
actually...
is his opportunity to play his third Strad viola, perhaps? Or?
Yeah, this is reminding me of the birding movie, The Great Year, where everybody goes out to see the most birds. This is play the most Strads in 1 year for a viola player.
I don't understand why there are viola jokes, though. I mean, there's only 10 of them, right? So.
Well, this happened to be my fifth
Fifth,
Strad
okay.
viola.
Okay.
I just remembered I played the Spanish
Oh, you did? The
set
quartet.
of Strad.
Okay. Yeah?
The instruments speak for themselves. I mean, the wonderful thing about doing a comparison like that is that there's no right or wrong. I mean, it's an aesthetic, and everyone gets to react the way they like. I think what you'll find, especially in the concert, that they're both absolutely splendid and marvelous. But I think it's, somebody was asking me earlier today about could you tell the differences between sounds of instruments, and I always like to think about the differences in human voices. And most of us, when someone we know calls them on the phone, just saying hello, you already know who it is. Don't even have to go to the next word. And they said, oh, I don't think I could ever understand the sound of two instruments, but I think you'll all agree, there's two voices, two great voices that are totally different.
But do you feel, playing in the quartet, when you've got this range of years between the two instruments, any differences? Like, was one more, do you think one was more, the 1690 was not a solo? The thought wasn't a solo, it was built as, you know, a set, versus the 1727 time when you were saying maybe he was going toward the more Paganini solo sound. Do you think that is any?
You know, it's a hard question to ask. Now, one
to
thing
ask, to answer.
to answer, and, well, to ask back then. But one thing that makes it easier to answer is, and this is really true of virtually every Strad viola, is they're all in really great condition. I mean, these instruments have almost never been changed, never been touched, and I can say that's true of virtually all the others. I'm trying to think of the 10 now. Yeah, just perfect condition. So by that I'm saying we get to hear a little bit of what Stradivari meant when he was building the instruments. Now, strings is a big question. And I think that my first question is why only 10? And the answer comes, usually with with bowed string instruments, the answer to almost every question comes down to some kind of technological problem. The biggest one is string making, and the other one is what was being asked by the audience or the composers, meaning composition and repertoire. And we're still kind of scratching our heads about the virtuosic solo viola pieces of the 17th or 16th century. By the 18th century, we start to see some. But the question about strings was really a problem, and this may have been something that Stradivari was wrestling with. Now, back then, strings were made of gut. Basically, the material that the string is made of is a little bit like the membrane of sausage today. It's gut that's cleaned and pulled very fine and twisted together. To make a low sound, you have to have a lot more mass because gut's not very dense. Now today, we have metal that we've added to gut, or even instead of gut, we have cores made of synthetics that people like who worked at DuPont would create. And that's why we can have the kind of sounds we have today. The viola string of that period would have been like a rope. And it would have taken talk about the effort, would have taken huge effort to get that C string started. And you would have just about had to take some sap off a tree and just wipe it on your bow to get enough going. And it would wobble like a rubber band. That would have been a challenge, and may very well have been something that had to evolve before the viola repertoire was going to get written. I like to think, or do think, that string composition and repertoire went hand in hand. Mm-hmm. When you see big launches in metallurgy and big launches in refinement of string making, you look over in composition and you see all of a sudden now they can ask the players to play way high up, to do lots of things, and this is way true in the world of the cello where the strings are so big. I like to think of strings as seasoning on food. You've tried different strings. What have your experiences been?
Oh, yes. Well, each instrument is very different, what it asks for and what you're looking for as well. So I've tried many different strings. I was playing actually another old Italian instrument from around the same period as this one, a Tekler, for a while, and with that instrument, I had a set of strings that I used that I was just so convinced about, and then now I'm playing a modern instrument by a wonderful maker, and so I of course tried the same set, and of course it didn't work the same way. So I think it's just a matter of experimentation, and sometimes, well, like you were saying with the C string, to go for a little bit punchier kind of direct C string. We were actually talking about, we both use Spiracore tungsten on our normal instruments. And at first I was a little reluctant to that string. I thought it was a little too intense, but now I'm used to it.
It's also very expensive.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, it is very expensive. Yeah, I don't change it.
Almost like $50.
Yeah.
Yes. You don't want to break this all the time.
But luckily they last a long time.
Yeah.
But you heard the word tungsten from these folks. I will have to say we're indebted to the NASA space program for the sound of music today, because they've come up with abilities with titanium, with tungsten, and several other very fine metals that really came out of that program. So our tax dollar helped for tonight's concert.
John, do you want to maybe
Right.
give them some of these?
So getting back to the decade of the 90s for Stradivari, 1690, so to 1699 really, was the time when Stradivari built this long period instrument. And he was so convinced by it that he used it for both violins and violas. And what we were interested in doing is showing you, and we'll look at the backs of these two. Now, how many violin players are there in the crowd? A few. So you might know that the violin of today is a much kind of wider, squarer shape than today, and I don't know how well people can see from here. But we look at this, those of us who build instruments, and basically see this is just a big version of this. And this is what is called the long period Strad. This one was made in 1699. This one was made in 1690. Basically, he used that pattern for all that time. And then 1700, 1701, where the Ward violin's from, he immediately changes. So afterwards, you can look in the case and start to see, instead of a long, and if you look at the upper bout, which is the part at the top of the back, it's very bullet-shaped. And then look at that one, and you'll see it's all of a sudden much broader and squarer. But I think it's fascinating to see this combination, and now you all know much more than most people. What is a long period Strad? That's it. And I'll show you what happened later, if you can keep that in your eye. So this is the Cassavetti, 1727. Can people see that kind of a difference?
I'll hold it up.
Sure.
You want to?
Maybe we can hold this one.
Thank you.
I'm showing you the back so you don't get any confusion from strings and F-holes and things. The back is the pure shape. Does that make more sense now?
I can't. But so built on the same mold.
And
A
so
slight variation, natural.
yeah, so by pulling it out, and I don't know if you can see by holding it sideways, probably not from your distance, you get a more barrel-shaped instrument, and I think that's responsible for that sound. A lot of people think of violin makers, especially back then, as kind of primitive kind of crafts people that were building instruments. They were really very, very sophisticated. Stradivari himself had very close acquaintances, almost relatives, who were top engineers, top architects, top woodcarvers too, who would have shared with him mathematical formulas, and especially something a lot of you might have heard of called the golden mean or the golden number. We find that over and over again on these instruments. Everything was calculated very, very precisely. Nothing is random, nothing is haphazard. The top mathematicians of the day and of today can put those same formulas on these and find everything back just the way it should be according to this thing. So nothing was just like, random sculpted shapes. It was really very precise and understood, and I think they were sharing that.
John, do any players today request a viola on one of these models, or?
Well, yeah, the Strad model is very sought after. Sure, it's
no, I
very
mean
rich.
on these years, or any in particular, any viola.
Yeah, I would say that since there's only 10, there are just a couple that keep getting used. But yes, I mean a lot of makers today are building copies of this shape, which is basically when we build it, we build a mold, therefore we've built the mold that Stradivari built. Interesting, there's a very well-known one called the Arquinto, which is owned by the Royal Academy in London. And Kikuei, you can make a comment about the sound.
Well, the Arquinto is very similar to Medici.
So 1696 versus 1690, 6 years apart.
Yes. And that instrument had a wonderful lower sound. You know, some of the Stradivarius viola, like Paganini, are very soprano happy. So when you're playing A string and the top really sound zooming out, and you can feel it really carries very well. But in the lower sound, it's not as strong or as rich. But this Arquinto had a wonderful lower string as this one. And I really enjoyed particularly playing second viola, which you need to support from the bottom. So I'm having a great time.
And the reason why I was pleased to hear it from him, because this is actually its reputation, the Arquinto and the Tuscan, is that they're two that actually sound the most similar in terms of that same kind of sound, and actually they're two that were made most closely together on the same long pattern art idea in that same decade. So.
Does anyone in the audience have a question for one of the performers? We're going to have to let them go soon to get ready, and we will have to let them take their instruments with them. So please direct any questions right now that you might have. Go ahead.
Just a general question about acoustics and performance. You were talking about turning and the position of the instruments in the quartet. I just wondered, there must be some acoustical spaces which are especially good for the performers, but maybe not so great for the audience, and vice versa. And just wondered, I know Coolidge is perfect in every respect. Yes.
Yes, of course, different spaces will be very, very different. Sometimes they're so resonant that there's nothing you can do as a performer to articulate enough or to make things clear enough. Then sometimes the sound just stops right there and doesn't do anything for you. So yeah, definitely. And then sometimes, like you're saying, that maybe it's good for the performer but not so good for the audience, or vice versa. You may think that it sounds great, and then you go out and listen, it doesn't sound so great. So.
And what about the difference between a hall full of people and an empty hall?
Well, yes, that's always going to change the hall a lot, or almost always. That it's going to soak up a little bit of the sound. Yeah, it should be interesting tonight to feel that, because with these instruments being so resonant and the hall being very, beautifully live, I think we'll look forward to having that difference. Yeah.
Anyone else?
From the time of their creation, did the Stradivari instruments enjoy the same reverence that they experience today, or have they gone in and out of fashion?
They've always had that same reverence. In other words, the commissions, the ones that got finished and some that didn't, many of them were by royalty. King Charles and the Tuscan, of course, and the Spanish court ordered them. So yeah, I mean, it was the finest. If you were going to get first of all, if you were going to get an instrument back then, you got a Cremonese instrument. So this included the Amatis and the Guarneris. But if you were going to get the finest, you got Stradivari. So that was true. And then that never did stop. Yeah. And that's why Paganini, when he decided, I want a quartet, he got a quartet of Stradivaris. He could have maybe gotten Amatis or something else, but he said, no, I'm going to have Stradivaris.
And this is something, to me, the specialty of the Stradivarius is it doesn't sound loud under your ear. It's actually quite amazing. Some of the modern instruments, it sounds so loud under your ear, so it's almost like too much for me. But Stradivarius never like that, and it seems like it's really carrying, and it is carrying. It's amazing. You play one note in Carnegie Hall on stage, and you can feel it comes back. So that means it's carrying, that carrying power.
So fine sherry, not really a hard whiskey.
Go ahead.
Say something briefly about artists of unquestioned celebrity status, unquestioned top-flight instrumentalists. The one that comes to mind at the moment is Christian Tetzlaff, who probably, whether out of his own bank account or some patron, from some philanthropic patron, could endow him with a Stradivarius instrument, but nevertheless swears by a modern instrument, which I guess he routinely plays, all the time. So it's a question of modern versus, how much of the value that we ascribe is basically that I'm asking is a function of one's imagination rather than demonstrable superiority.
You're looking at me, but I'm going to deflect the question to
I think
Jessica.
they should answer that.
Well, it's interesting because Tetzlaff actually plays a Greiner, and I also play a Greiner viola. And so I've known Greiner instruments for a long time, and actually the first violinist in our quartet, he also plays a Greiner violin. And so it's, of course I can't speak for Christian Tetzlaff per se, but there's something about some modern instruments that are so, in a way, they're kind of reliable. It's kind of like what you're gonna get, and it's very solid in that way. And I can imagine that that's one reason that Tetzlaff would choose the instrument. For us, we didn't have a large enough back pocket or a donor in order to get us instruments. So we were both borrowing instruments for a while, and we had to give them back, and we were in the situation where we had to figure out what to do. And so we felt incredibly lucky to be able to have Greiner instruments. And for us, we did sort of a test yesterday in the hall when they left for a few minutes. I played my Greiner viola, and then I played the Strad viola, and just to see what it felt like, the difference. And of course, the Strad has so much more color, and it's such a great opportunity to play the Strad, but the Greiner is also it's not so bad. It's not horrible, and for us right now, it's okay. So it would be really interesting to actually ask Tetzlaff and get his answer, but I feel like, especially for some really great modern makers, they're doing really wonderful things.
And I might add, I have a button in my shop that I wear sometimes that says Strad made new violins.
How much time do you like to have to prepare when you switch to an instrument you haven't played before, before a concert like this?
Well, in my case, it was more of a fear than anything else, because I didn't know what to expect. I could go on the internet and see the chart, but actually hold the viola and how it's going to relate to me, or I could relate to the instrument, and so I had all kinds of fear, the instrument would not like me, and maybe it's too big or too small, but it turned out it was perfect.
So not much time.
So actually, I came first here at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I planned to play the whole day. I didn't. After a couple of hours, I felt, yeah, I know this instrument.
What about you, Jessica?
Yeah, for me, Kikuei has a lot more experience than I do, and so I feel like for me it's a little bit difficult to switch instruments, and actually when I came before and I was playing the Tekler, the ratio of how the fingerboard and the body of the instrument connected was so different than the Strad. So I remember the last time we were here, I had a very, very difficult time. And so I was also very nervous because I had remembered that difficulty. But then since I've been playing the Greiner, it is a little bit more similar in terms of just where things lie in the instrument, so it's a little bit easier. What I find to be different is just to figure out how the sound is carrying and and how that affects actually how even your left hand works, because when you use the sound to carry through things and to help you with things like shifts or with big stretches and things like that. And so that's very difficult, because even though it technically feels very similar, just the way the sound works is not so similar. So that's been a bit of an adjustment, and I feel like maybe after a few months I would have a better idea of really what I'm doing, but at least we've been fortunate to have since Monday to work with these instruments. So
that sounds like a hint.
Yeah, the library doesn't have to-go boxes.
But going back to another person's question about the word reliability, how do you both feel about that with the older instruments versus, or even your newer instrument, you saying it was reliable? Do you find that these were reliable for you also in any way?
Well, I guess with reliable, it's I guess with that kind of situation, with the newer instrument, it's reliable in that when you ask it to do something, you have an idea of what it's going to give you. And then the really exciting thing about the Strad is that you ask for it to do something, and it might give you something that you've never even imagined before. So in that way, it's unreliable, but it's unreliable in a really exciting way. But that's also what makes it a little bit difficult. Yeah.
Anyone else? Oh, okay.
How often are these Strads, are they on loan outside of the library venue, or are they only used in the library, and how often are they used? And I didn't get the name of the second viola. You keep referring to the Tuscan, and this is all new to me, so what was the name of the other viola that
The Cassavetti. And also in the program, there's a great insert describing the instruments. I'm sorry about not using the name so much as the years. The library, not like some libraries where they loan things out a lot. When the violins were first given in 1935 by Mrs. Whitall, and the cello and the viola, the term of the gift and the bequest was that they don't leave the library, but that they get played. So we have worked with that. The loan in 1977 of the Tuscan-Medici viola is so that it gets played, but it has gone out to other venues, which is wonderful. Our Chrysler violin, which is in the left case over there, doesn't have the stipulation about that. So in certain circumstances, yes, they go out, but not on loan, like you would think normally. We do have a Guarneri, which a part of the gift was for it to be out on a longer loan. And that is with the Borromeo Quartet, and so that will be for a few years.
And is there
yes.
Is there a certain criteria as to who you would loan these out to? Do they have to pass a bar or something like that?
That's a good question. The Viome, the National Symphony Orchestra, had asked if we had an instrument that was available, and at that time we had just received an instrument that was given, hopefully to be used or to be played. And so the timing of that was quite good. In that case, that worked out. We really haven't had that experience so much since then. Did you have a question? Yes. I'm sorry.
I guess we might also at this moment thank Mrs. Coolidge, because we actually have a place to play them.
I have a question about pitch, and that has been an important thing. Today we hear, as in old times. What is the pitch during Stradivari or Niccolò Amati? And then the violin had to fight with an orchestra of 30 people. When Brahms came in and wrote his concerto, there were bigger instruments, and then you mentioned guts and metal strings. So how have the mold of the violins been changed? Strengthening the sound post and any other changes?
So maybe I'll answer that question. Before I answer that question, the musicians actually need to go to warm up, so I'd like to give them a round of applause for You know, it's just such a thrill to have this inside look, I think, because now you're going to get to go and hear them in the trenches. You know, you mentioned the word pitch, and for those people who might not be aware, I think you're talking about the frequency at which the instrument notes are played. All bowed string instruments tuned to an A. Today, it can go from 440, and in some of the orchestras, it's actually even higher than that. This is the Hertz resonance. But in Strad's days, we were probably talking about 415, so we're almost a half step below. And I will say, from working with so many instruments myself, there are actually some instruments, and pretty many instruments, that actually sound richer and even better at the lower pitch. You play them at the low pitch and think, wow, this thing's so great. And then you tune it up a little bit more and you go, ah, it lost just a little bit of its resonance. You know, it's taut sounding. So, and this, of course, leads into people who are doing period performance. And I know there's a lot of that coming up on the library schedule, so you have a chance to hear that. And while you're sitting listening to period performers, you might just ask yourself about extra resonance in the sounds. It's always interesting and hard to isolate that because the playing style is so different and the bowing is so different. But it really is one of the charming things about performing as it might have been heard in Stradivari's days. With respect to the structure of the instruments, on the one hand, they're virtually the same. On the other hand, there's some small differences. So inside the instruments, there is something called a bass bar, which is a bar of wood that sits under the bass side of the bridge that actually gives support to the bridge. And it keeps the shape of the arch nice. On the treble side, there's a post of wood called the sound post. So those two things did get changed from the 17th and 18th century till today. But, you know, basically they look the same. The big change really, as I said before, is this composition of the strings and how they're made. What's beautiful about the violin that makes it a brilliant instrument is its architecture. And I compare this to a guitar or worse, a lute. Interestingly enough, lutes were made in greater numbers than almost violins, and yet there's so few lutes today because architecturally there was a flat top, they sunk, they didn't hold up. All of a sudden you get to the violin family and they're arched. What a brilliant shape. And the other beautiful thing about violins is they have an edge, whereas guitars are finished in a corner, there's no way to take them apart and fix them. Violins have an edge, meaning we can take them apart, and if the shape changes a little bit, we can put them back together again. So those are just some simple things. The necks changed, the string lengths changed. It's a continuing relationship between instrument makers and players to keep these things performing the way they need to perform. Once again, that string, I just can't say that enough how important string technology has been and how much we react to that. Yes, halls make a difference. Now players are asked to be playing in such big concert halls, and they've got to hit the last guy who also paid his admission. So we're doing a very different acoustic performance today than Strad's day, where they were being played for courts, you know, smaller spaces.
Yeah, given that you have almost all the information you could need to try to replicate the Strad, and people talked before about varnishes and other factors, how close could you come to replicating it?
So we've done it.
Oh, we've come very close.
We've done it. We've replicated already. So technology again. So, and really this has been a collaboration with the Library of Congress to actually study them under the highest imaging equipment that we have today. And so we've got CT scans of the violins here. And we've been able to then take those CT scans and run them through a CNC router, which is a router that basically takes that information and now cuts wood so precisely that even the grain lines, so maybe you pick a different piece of wood and maybe the grain lines aren't exactly the same as the one you're copying, it'll actually put the grain lines in on top of that piece of wood that already has grain lines. And we've done this, we've done a project at Oberlin College where a bunch of violin makers have come together and done this process and actually built the instrument. We had a very fortunate situation in that the first one that was done under that process turned out so incredible, and a donor actually, a fellow named Bill Sloan, actually acquired it and made it as a donation to the Library of Congress. So it's actually here now, and the reason is because it was a copy of the Betz Stradivari that you're going to hear tonight, played by Daniel, the first violin. You're going to hear the real Betz. But the comparison between the two has been absolutely remarkable. Not that we're ever going to say one replaces the other, but to say that we've come so far in understanding that we as makers today can make totally, as Jessica was saying, totally satisfying instruments. That's the beauty, is that all violin players and viola players don't have to be millionaires. They can get really great sounding instruments. So, yeah, I think we're, will you say it's exactly the same? I don't think you would want to. But have we learned an enormous amount? Yeah, I mean, we're keeping this music going. I wouldn't build violins if nobody bought them.
Do you build violas?
I build violas too, sure. Yeah.
A lot?
Not a lot. I built 10. Do we need to wait for a microphone here?
I don't think so.
Well, I think that's getting recorded. There we go.
I've seen both a cello and bows made out of carbon fiber. I wonder if you would say something about the similarity or difference in sound and what you think the future might be for that technology.
Well, of course, instruments have been made for alternative materials for a while. Heifetz actually played on a violin that was made by Alcoa out of aluminum. He used to play it on ships because the moisture wouldn't affect it. And of course, it was obvious that it was going to be carbon fiber next because it's such an amazing material. So far the sound is actually quite pleasant. It's really quite interesting, very resonant and rich. But when they talk about the complexity and the colors, this word colors really comes a lot. They don't have that yet. So that material does have a limitation that way. It certainly works in a totally different way in terms of flexibility. And of course, it does take away some of the things that are so sensitive that we makers do, where we'll take a piece of wood and we're almost massaging it into the shape of a wooden violin. Whereas those, you're kind of restricted by the technical process of working carbon fiber. It's surprisingly interesting sounding. And of course, the beauty of sound is that it's an aesthetic which we all get to be the final judges of. And so if you like that sound, it's great. But it's got some interesting potentials, and we're using it in other ways. Like one of the things that's interesting is we'll take carbon fiber and inlay it into the neck of a violin and change the sound quite dramatically, also giving stability to the one thing that's very thin and gets sweated on a lot and could potentially change and warp. But you put that rod down there and it's very strong, especially on a cello, which is such a long neck. So it's finding uses, and certainly it's finding lots of uses in ways that we do restoration more than actually. So I don't think it's going to take over. I think we're waiting for that. Yeah. Do we need a microphone?
So just to follow up on that, you talked about the close association between technology and compositions. Have these alternate material instruments led to modern compositions that play to that sound?
The quick answer is the electric violin. You don't get any more different technology.
Well, okay, yes.
And people are composing and playing for it, and it's a new world, and it's still a violin.
But I assume, I mean, the carbon fiber and the aluminum were still acoustic. They weren't necessarily electric pickup transducers.
I mean, I think so. I mean, it's always a hard, it's a chicken or egg kind of question.
Yes.
But I think composers, are really hearing. And of course, some composers are more familiar. Some composers are actually violin players. And so they're going to have a little bit more sensitivity. You might ask the same question of conductors. Most conductors actually were instrumentalists. Some of them pianists, some of them trumpet players, some of them violin players. When I hear those conductors, I actually hear a sensitivity to their instrument that I don't always hear. I mean, they can be great masters at their medium, but and when you talk to the players in those orchestras, they say, oh yeah, he really understands me. I'm a viola player, and he is too.
And do the other ones feel left out?
I don't think they get to. So, but yeah, I think the effect is happening. Looking at all the fascinating modern music that's being composed, they may not know why they're able to do what they're able to do, but the musicians wouldn't be able to do it if the technology wasn't there. If the string didn't react the way it was going to allow them to do some special effect, the composer wouldn't include it. An example I think of is Bach when he was writing for cellos. He was horribly frustrated. The cello's string didn't allow them to do what he was asking them to do. And there were a number of occasions where he was writing these things and cellos weren't. Now, not long after that, technology changed the cello string. The C string became something that responded very quickly, and people played Bach beautifully. Or they learned more techniques, and instead of playing the fifth suite on a 5-string cello, now they do it on a 4-string cello, but they figured out how to run up and down the A string to create what they would have done just by moving over to another string.
Mm-hmm. But it
So,
does happen with other musical instruments too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you'll see that which came first,
right.
even with the flute or anything else like that, or the Beethoven symphonies. Beethoven may be responding to things like that. Do you think Stradivari was responding to anything between?
Yeah, no, definitely he was, and that's why we see these changes. You know, another discussion can be had just like this about his cellos and about his violins too. I mean, he was paying a lot of attention to what the musicians were doing and saying, as I do today. Musicians walk into my shop and they challenge me. Do this, do that, make it better, make it all. And I'm there to please them. You know, without them, I'm nothing.
You're always here. Any more questions? No? All right, well, thank you. Now you're all in for a very big treat in the auditorium right here. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.